Okay, we're now recording. So just a reminder, if people are okay with keeping themselves muted, that would be great, just so we can reduce background noise. And then if you have a question, if you could type your question into the chat function in Zoom, then we can alert Mariah and let her know that we have a question coming from the participants. So I'm gonna mute myself and turn it over to Mariah.
Cool. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to come and talk about monitoring and evaluation and theory of change with you guys. This is something that I've used a lot recently in my, oops.
Lower the,
Sorry.
yeah,
okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, should I move? I can make this
Sorry.
Okay. I started talking and all of a sudden everyone like got up and started moving around. Cool.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so as I was saying, this is something that I've used a lot recently in my work. I just returned from a RIFA fellowship, which is it's a funding opportunity here at UC Davis for international development projects, and I was in Uganda for 6 months. Yeah.
Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, how do I?
So just share screen, the green button.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
And then
Share screen in the bottom.
Oh,
right.
I see. Okay. Weird. The mouse is so strange. Okay.
Perfect. We can now.
You can see that. Okay. So yes, so monitoring and evaluation, and I think Amanda Crump is coming in. Is it next week? Oh, in 2 weeks. Okay. To talk about maybe more in depth some of the things that I'm going to bring up today. So today I'm really just introducing theory of change, logical frameworks, and how those both contribute or can help you produce a monitoring and evaluation plan.
You can make their screen smaller by that little.
Okay. Cool. So here's just a quick outline of what I'm going to cover today. Theory of change, monitoring and evaluation, and log frames are often used. Those terms are often used a bit sloppily in the development community in particular, and so I'm going to go over a quick overview of what each of them is and try to convey a bit of a definition and a sense of how they relate to each other, but are not the same. And then we'll go more in depth into each of them. So theory of change, and then monitoring and evaluation, or M&E, and logical frameworks, or log frames. So the learning objectives that I got from Lauren, which we'll cover today, are supposed to kind of support you in developing your own M&E plan for your Trellis project. So those objectives are to be able to interpret a theory of change, and I'll show some examples today that should help you be able to do that. Make a connection between theory of change and M&E, and create your own theory of change for your Trellis project. And this should be done with your organization if possible. I had presenter notes and I can't see any of them, unfortunately. Do you know if there's a way to do that?
If you send your presentation to one of us can share our screens, and then you can not share your screen.
Mm-hmm. I think it's okay.
Whatever's easier for you.
Okay. So these are just a bunch of components of a project that I'm not sure exist. I hope it doesn't exist because it looks really complicated, but you might have a similar sort of soup of words and concepts floating around in your head right now about the project that you're about to go do. I know I did last year at this time when I was preparing to go to Uganda. I knew that I have an organization that I'm working with. I knew that we have certain material inputs, and there are people involved, and there are like institutions involved, and it was all just kind of very disorganized in my head. And so going into starting an M&E plan and starting to think about how to put that together really helped me get all of this organized into a more clear and concise expression of what I'm doing, what I have, and what my activities are that are contributing to like larger social change. So that's what these tools that I'll show you today are kind of good for, is organizing what you have, what your resources are, what you're doing with them, and how and why they help you contribute to longer term, kind of larger scale goals. Hi. Theory of change and monitoring and evaluation and log frame, as I said, are kind of often used to mean the same things or similar things, or even used interchangeably. And so I wanted to first go over them really quickly and give you some brief definitions of what they are and how they're related to each other. So I think you guys are required to do an M&E plan for Trellis, right? So M&E is monitoring and evaluation, and monitoring means the analysis or collection and analysis of information and data about your program or your project as it's happening. So you develop sort of a set of things that you want to measure, and then you measure them in an ongoing way and look at the trends to try to see what's going on with your indicators that should tell you whether you're successful or not. And evaluation is more like a periodic or occasional retrospective look at what those indicators are showing you. So that's usually done after big like milestones in a project, or at the very end of a project when you're wrapping things up and you need to create a summary of what you did and whether you were successful. So theory of change is sort of like a tool to describe what you think the process of change is that you're tapping into with your work. So it's supposed to be an abstract or strategic level description of how social change happens in the geographic location that you're working in the political setting that you're working in the economic setting that you're working in. So it's not so much what am I doing, but it's more how does change happen generally in this place and in these conditions. And then the logical framework is also an illustration of a change process, but it's more at the level of your project, at the implementation or the intervention level. So instead of saying, how does change happen in this place? You're saying, how do I make change happen in this place?
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Could you give an example for theory of change? I don't know if I understand.
Yeah, so I'm going to go into a whole bunch of examples in the next slides. So as I said just then, a theory of change is this like very abstract set of predictions or assumptions about how you think change might happen. So how do farmers' incomes increase? How and why do farmers' incomes increase in this place? How and why do we create a stable agricultural market in this place? Things like that are pretty abstract and not necessarily things that you are directly putting your hands on in the project. In order to make a theory of change, you need to be able to get a good sense of what's happening in the current context of your project. And also identify and critique your own assumptions about how you think that change process happens. So a lot of places, if you were to look this up online, and I did when I was preparing for this presentation, you'll find a lot of people talk about theory of change as this backwards mapping process where you start with a long-term goal and then you move backward from that and say, what has to happen for us to achieve that long-term goal? That is a great way to create a theory of change, but it really works the best if you are like an organization with a bunch of money and a bunch of staff and you're given a mandate to address a certain goal. It really works well when it's like the start of the process. But for you guys, you're jumping into existing projects and organizations that already kind of have probably an idea of what their long-term goals are and some idea of how they are approaching achieving those goals. And so just be aware of that if you go online and look at this, or when you create your own theory of change, that you might find some people saying you have to start with the long-term goal, but you don't necessarily. I think you can move both directions, backward from that goal and also forward from some of the like finer scale preconditions that contribute to that goal. And a theory of change is also really helpful for helping the project team get on the same page about how and why they're doing the work they're doing and how it contributes to those goals. So, and that also helps you develop good communications materials, reports, things like that at the end of the project when you need to report back to your funder or talk about your project to outside entities. So here's what a theory of change looks like in its most simple form. It's usually a graphical illustration of these causal relationships between preconditions and long-term outcomes. So we have this long-term outcome listed at the top. And then the question, what has to happen in order for us to get to that long-term outcome? And the answers to that question form these preconditions. And some preconditions have their own preconditions, and some of those have their own preconditions. So it can kind of layer back until you have a map of all of these kind of causal pathways that lead to this long-term outcome. And I think this is easier to see in an example. So I'm going to go ahead and go to that. So this is an example from my own project in Uganda, which I did last year. And I had a conversation with a farmer about how she thinks like change is happening in the environment and in the agricultural community that she's a part of. So she told me that she thinks farmers in general in her area have a stable year-round income when they have adequate water supply, access to manure to fertilize their crops, and the market for the products that they're producing is robust. But in order for people to have a year-round water supply, they need a way to store and transport water. So that's like a precondition for the water supply precondition. In order for them to be able to access manure, they need cattle herds that are healthy and abundant in that area. And in order for them to have a stable and robust market, they need to be choosing crops that are desirable for the community that's buying from that market. And then finally, in order to have enough cattle around, the grazing land in that area needs to be sufficient and also high enough quality for those cattle to be able to live on it. So I also pointed out to her that she's making some assumptions when she's making these causal chains. So I'll focus first on this irrigation branch of the diagram. So in order for farmers to have a year-round water supply from their water storage and irrigation systems, they need to actually know how to use those irrigation systems. And so if they don't know how to use them, then the equipment might sit in the field and not be used. And so there's an assumption built in that like the farmers around her are going to be using the irrigation systems in the way that they're intended to be used. And if they have that water supply, they also need to know and follow the water requirements of their crops. That's another assumption that she's making here. So if those assumptions hold true, then this branch of the diagram is like a valid causal chain. Yeah.
We had a question come in chat. What factors were considered to narrow down those three preconditions, right? Like the second row down, water, manure, and demand.
Yeah, so for now, this is a very like simple version of a theory of change, sort of just to illustrate the structure. I think I'll show you some examples of some more complicated ones. I don't think that any of yours will look quite this simple either. And I think it is a process of working with your organization and your stakeholders to identify what that like top level set of preconditions are. So there's no formula for it really. It's just good communication with your stakeholders and the organization to make sure that you all have a similar sense of what's contributing to the long-term outcome. So I hope that answers the question. And I think it should be more clear once I get into the next slides. So you can also see a couple of other assumptions here. Even if there are lots of cattle around and the herds are healthy and abundant, if those cattle owners are keeping that manure for themselves or they're selling it outside the area, that's going to invalidate this causal relationship. So this assumption, if it's true, makes this relationship like true and keeps the integrity of this causal chain. Similarly with the grazing land, that's even if it's abundant, it needs to be covered with edible forage for those cattle. So similarly also that farmers are actually maintaining the quality of their produce between the field and the market. So they're using good post-harvest practices. And when they are, their market demand for farm products should contribute to the stable year-round income in this case.
I have another question.
Okay.
Did you evaluate an already established project, or I guess was this in like the planning phases? This is actually, rather than evaluating the project, this is evaluating the conditions in the area and how change happens in that area, regardless of whether that project is doing something there or not. So we will talk about log frames, which I think might be closer to what that person is asking about, which do talk about what are the causal linkages that allow like my own work to contribute to an outcome. So I guess the answer is yes, but not in this theory of change diagram. So the theory of change, again, is like a larger, more abstract view of how change happens, not how I'm making that change happen. So a theory of change should be specific to your project. It should be rooted in the geographic location, in the political context, in the economic context, and in the social context. But it should also make sense to someone unfamiliar with your work. So they should be able to take a look at it and see how you're connecting the various components and preconditions. And it shouldn't contain technical language or jargon that someone unfamiliar with your work wouldn't know. So creating a theory of change is also a good way to make sure that you and your organization are on the same page about why you're doing what you're doing, how your project works, its mechanisms, and the objectives that you're working toward. And so it's also a good way to test your knowledge about what you're doing and identify some places where maybe you don't know why your organization is approaching a problem in a certain way. And that gives you a pathway to ask questions and have a discussion with them. So there are some other ways that theories of change are represented. One of the most common is this kind of results chain or causal chain. So if you look this up online, you might find these. And if this makes sense to you, I think you should consider doing this. I prefer the flowchart diagram because it's a little harder to confuse with the log frame, which we'll look at in a few minutes. But this model basically takes like those long-term outcomes and moves backward if you move against the arrows. Through like short-term outcomes, other short-term outcomes, and then eventually identifies kind of at the finest level some strategies for causing those outcomes to occur. Here's an example of a much more complicated theory of change from the Hunger Project. And don't worry about trying to read those boxes. They're pretty small, but the thing I wanted to point out here, just by way of contrast to show you another way of setting up a theory of change diagram, is that they've grouped their preconditions into groups that are kind of related. So they have gender and equity and human rights here, health and nutrition, good governance, and they're not identifying the specific arrows between all of those components. I think because their initiative is so enormous and broad, it would be awfully messy to try to represent it with individual arrows. And so
that, and that they've produced this diagram for more public dissemination and want it to be understandable and pretty, I think was a good reason for them to group them like that. So just notice that, and also that they're representing institutional and social factors as well. So kind of thinking of all the different ways that they are getting to this top level outcome. Okay, so I wanted to do a quick example of one with Lauren's project. And I think if I leave presenter view, I can type into this. And so hopefully once we've done this, it should be more clear how to even begin doing such a thing. So does anyone have any other questions first before we start that? No? Okay, cool. So can you tell me a little bit about your project?
Yeah, so this project aims at increasing the consumption of sweet potato leaves, especially among women and children who experience malnutrition at higher rates than men. And so right now, sweet potato leaves are primarily fed to animals as fodder, and it's not really culturally accepted in this part of Ethiopia for humans to eat them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's part social and behavior communication change,
Mm-hmm.
Developing recipes, mm-hmm. and trying to figure out how to increase consumption in a way that fits with the culture and the local circumstances.
Okay. So would you say that I'm just going to take a couple other notes here.
Sure.
Would you say that the top level outcome is increasing consumption?
I would say that's a middle level outcome, okay. And it's really improving maternal and child nutrition and health.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Yep, so that would be, and so in order to achieve improved maternal and child health, you mentioned increasing potato leaf consumption, behavior change, I heard you say.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other, actually, can we refine behavior change at all to, you mentioned something around that, like, I forget what your words were, but.
SBCC, so social and behavior communication change. It's just, mm-hmm. I think one of the ways to view this particular project is mm-hmm. the approach.
Okay. And so what is the outcome that approach is supposed to achieve at this level, at the behavior level? Like something like people want or habitually eat this food?
Yeah, so I think it might be like making the active choice to feed it to their families instead of feeding it to cattle.
Okay.
Or actively purchasing it at the market instead of something else.
Yep. Okay. So would that, and that's, do you think that that's on the same level or a different level as increasing sweet potato leaf consumption? Or are those the same thing?
I think that it's below. So that's like a precondition to lead to consumption.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then there's recipes. So we have this, like, I'm starting to see this branch emerge, which is like around choice and consumption. But I think this recipes gets at the idea that people also need to know, like, what it is that they're that they're being asked to eat and how to eat it.
Yeah.
Right? So can we refine this one?
Yeah, so I think that is related to knowledge, having the knowledge and the skills and the tools to be able to increase your consumption.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the project is for me to do a literature review
mm-hmm.
of what are the nutritional benefits of sweet potato leaves. So how do they compare to, say, spinach or other leafy greens in terms of iron or vitamin A, and then also to explore ways that sweet potato leaves have been incorporated into the human diet in other places.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of those findings will funnel into training materials that then go into training farmers on
Mhm.
this is why you should eat more sweet potato leaves, and here's how you can do it, like steaming them, blanching them, drying them in a solar dryer.
Mhm. Okay. So they know, that means they know that it's nutritious. They know that it's nutritious. They know that it tastes good, probably, hopefully.
Yeah, and the way they can prepare it also tastes good, so
Yeah.
it's healthy and
Desirable, like from a taste perspective. Yeah.
palatable.
Okay. So that's, oops. I'm just gonna, oops. Let's see. Okay. I'm being a little cheeky here. You probably don't want to do that with your organization, but it helps you get your thoughts down, I think, to do it in a pretty messy way. So we have this like knowledge branch, and we have or we could think about it as an economic branch, like purchasing behaviors, and then we have knowledge and preparation. So I would think that these nutritionally beneficial and tasty maybe contribute to more of a cultural desire rather than a know-how. Would you say that? Or like a want, like I want that kind of like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also leaves are tasty is like the preparation has to be a precondition that the leaves are tasty, because you need to do something to them to make them palatable.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good. How to prepare. Okay. So that goes under tasty. Oh, I already had that. Okay, sorry. And then where does this nutritionally beneficial one go?
I wonder if that's like its own branch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because preparation and taste will contribute to increased consumption, but hopefully knowledge will also drive people to consume more.
You have to consider like how to grow it. Like, is it easy to grow in the weather, climate conditions? Are they growing it already? How do they increase production to make sure they can meet their demands if more people are eating it? Because they still need to feed their cattle.
Yeah, exactly.
So they go from cattle to places.
So the organization, I think, is looking at alternative fodder to fill the vacuum that will be created by diverting sweet potato leaves. But it is, I think, a really important question to know at what rate are families growing it themselves now versus having to purchase, like what kind of burden will this put on household purchasing?
In competition with cattle producers too, right? If they're current, or is it just the families they're giving them to the cattle?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if people are selling it as fodder or if it just like stays within the household.
Because if that's the current use, then you're going to have to divert that use. That's a first precondition, right? Because you have to divert it from its current streams.
Mm-hmm. Oops. So.
But that can kind of also go with the cultural thing, because if people are only used to feeding them to cattle, they won't want to eat them because they're like, oh, that's just what the cows eat, so we don't want to eat that. So for building a theory of change document, is it okay if the things all kind of overlap?
Crisscross, definitely, okay. Yeah, especially for something like this.
Do.
Yeah, yeah, they're not all as neat as that Hunger Project one. Okay, so can you guys help me organize this a little bit more? So, so increasing so that we have this sweet potato leaf consumption, I think might be, we can make it like half of our diagram, because that's what you're working on, right? But there are also other things that contribute to improve maternal and child health in Ethiopia.
Yeah,
so
I mean, there's like hygiene.
Tons of things, yeah, for sure. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but I'll leave a little spot over here on the left to include those. But so contributing to increased consumption are that people choose to purchase them, they know about the benefits. I think maybe that contributes to their choice to purchase, and they know how to prepare goes under that they're tasty and that there's a sufficient supply is somehow related to that cattle have enough other feed, right? So it seems like we have some branches emerging. Are there other preconditions that you guys can think of?
What about how easy it's for them to grow? Like,
Yeah, so enough slips, I guess. I wonder if that would fall under supply is sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
And like, doesn't that sound good? Sweet potatoes are produced from, they eat the sweet potatoes now, like the actual product that they're growing the sweet potato leaves for, or do they grow the sweet potato leaves just to feed cattle? Like,
Right, so orange, well, not orange slash white. So different varietals of sweet potatoes right now are consumed in country by people, and the actual like tuber root part is being consumed by people. So it's my understanding that the leaves are being cut off for fodder right now.
Okay. So I'm going to start making some arrows in here. So if cattle have enough other feed, hopefully that leaves enough for the human consumption market. I can just keep the arrow. And people can grow enough to feed themselves and maybe also to feed some number of cattle that are still consuming that. People know how to prepare them, so the dishes that they produce with these leaves are tasty. Hopefully the kids like them. And when something is tasty, usually it means people want to buy it. So you can make that.
Or even, I would put that arrow directly to increased consumption. Because I don't think people would purchase the already prepared.
Okay, yeah. Good point. Let me do that. That.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we making a condition that there's the purchasing implies like some sort of money transfer, right? When it's, I think, I don't know the situation, well, it's probably more likely that it's being cultivated
in a household setting, yeah.
purchase that grow.
Yeah.
Yep.
To grow it.
I'm just thinking if you wouldn't, it's doubtful that they'd use their discretionary income for something that they don't even necessarily culturally eat already.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, but even if they choose to grow it at home, there will be probably some kind of market transaction to support that. So seeds or, so I agree. Yeah, I think it's good to also consider maybe some of the branches that would move off of that, which would be like people have access to the right farm inputs to grow this crop and enough labor to grow it. So I think we'll keep it simple for now, but yeah.
Right, each one of these things can start spinning off into a fractal.
Exactly, yeah. And so you do need to kind of think about like what's the scope of what you're doing or what your organization is doing or the change process that your organization is operating within. So that's a good point, and that was the point that I was getting to when I mentioned other ways that maternal and child health happen in this place. So you mentioned something about hygiene.
Yeah, so wash, water, sanitation, hygiene practices. Yeah.
Do you think education has a role? Is that right? Is that how you spell hygiene? Yeah, okay. So you can kind of make a section on your theory of change for these because you want to know, sometimes you might have preconditions that don't necessarily even link upwards, but link sideways in your theory of change. And so if those might be things that you need to be aware of in your project, especially if you do a monitoring or evaluation step at some point and realize that that there's I don't know, something happening in local schools that make kids like really not want this. as like a meal to eat, or
I think one possible example with this would be, and I haven't confirmed this, but intra-household food allocation at food versus men.
Yep.
And so being aware of the gender, and we'll talk about this next week actually, being aware of some of the gender implications and how that can affect how your project plays out.
Are they tasty?
I cooked them before once, and yeah, like I think you can, like spinach, you can make anything taste good when you add a little salt and maybe some lemon or something.
So it's kind of like the market, like a salad, kind of like leafy green.
Yeah.
But they're trying to.
In Asian, in like when I grew up, we ate sweet potato leaves all the time. It wasn't like a weird thing.
Yeah.
It was just like, ate it. Yeah.
So can I make this connection that increasing consumption improves maternal and child health?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's some intermediaries between there, but.
Yeah, and that, so are those some assumptions that we need to add on here? We can just add a couple and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I would maybe just, I don't know if it's an assumption or an intermediary, but just something about how increasing leaf consumption increases dietary diversity, which then can improve maternal and child health. So that could be an assumption that increasing leaves, we're assuming that'll increase dietary diversity because we're assuming they're starting with a low diversity diet.
Okay.
And I think this is interesting because I created a problem tree for this project, and it's almost like the problems are being shifted. It's a similar, I think, kind of a similar structure.
Yeah,
we talked about problem
it
tree
is.
briefly last class for Trellis.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. And I think problem trees, you can do problem trees for any scale of a project or a program or a change process as well. So a theory of change is more, focused on the highest level way that change happens in place. How do we, so we can connect people choose to purchase and grow into increasing consumption? Yeah, okay. Any other assumptions that we can quickly jot down on here?
Where does the cultural shift fit in here? I think Claire mentioned like getting people to think about leaves as not just food for cows, but
I think that's a really big one.
Yeah, so how do we articulate that one? Like,
I guess it's like a change in stigma, which could kind of be its own branch underneath increasing sweet potato consumption, maybe.
What about
Like if it went in between increasing sweet potato consumption and people choose to purchase and grow it, because it all kind of plays into that.
would it be more related to education?
Yeah.
Cultural change, goes hand in hand with education, right?
I don't know if that's true because I can know something is good for me, but that doesn't mean I want to eat it, right? Like you can throw all these facts and think oranges are really great for you, but I'm still going to continue to hate oranges. It's kind of an irrational feeling about things, which I think with sweet potato leaves is kind of an irrational thing. They may know it's good for them, but they're just like, cows eat that. I don't want to eat that.
Yeah, so it's shifting cultural norms, I guess.
Yeah, but that, so if you don't like oranges, you don't like them because they're like the dregs of the food.
No, I don't.
You know, like it's not.
It's irrational. Like my mom wanted me to eat it as a kid, and I'm like, I don't want to eat it, and it just became this thing that I don't like them anymore. So it's not very rational. Like I know it's good for me. I know it's healthy. I know people think it tastes good, but in my mind, it's not that way.
Okay.
So I feel like.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I meant by that can play into a lot of different things, and there's probably some driving factors behind all of these that connect, kind of connect the pieces and have an impact on each branch. But it is hard to find a place to put it.
Yeah.
So maybe it flows from how to prepare, and that leaves are nutritionally beneficial. Those are both sort of like education-based, sort of like cultural change concepts. That the first one is nutritionally beneficial. You're identifying that it's something that you might want to eat. Also, knowing how to prepare food and how to prepare it. Both those are preconditioned on identifying it as a food. So,
Yeah, it also kind of goes with the, like, maybe above leaves are tasty, because like you were saying, even if you know that they taste good, if you're usually only feed it to cows, you're not going to want to consume it.
Yeah. So you think it may be more here and yeah. Okay.
Everywhere.
Yeah, I know. That's a good point. Yeah, and you can do your crisscrossing arrows and be messy as much as you want, and you should be.
I guess it kind of goes to show you how important something really is if it connects to multiple facets of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Okay. Do you guys feel like the assumptions are clear to you, how to identify those? Should we do a few more of those, or should we continue? We'll look at a couple more examples too. So
We can do more examples.
Okay.
Should we check in with everyone from here? Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, does anyone on the Zoom have a question at this point? Can they hear you guys?
If we talk about
Okay.
But there's nothing in the chat.
Okay, cool. All right, so we will continue. So the last thing I wanted to ask about with this, and maybe you know already, or maybe you don't, and you can make a guess, how do you think your organization might measure some of these things, like increasing sweet potato consumption, sweet potato leaf consumption, people's choices to purchase it or grow it?
Excellent question. I mean, there are like nutritional ways to measure things, like measure markers in blood and things like that, but like definitely that's not going to happen in this project.
Yeah.
I would imagine it would be through like a survey, just like maybe 24-hour diet recall or something, just asking people if try to assess if their consumption patterns have changed after the intervention.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Survey is definitely a tool that organizations use a lot to try to capture behavior change. Yeah. So consumption rate, I guess, would be maybe like a metric that you could identify. Like, and I'm not sure, you'd have to think about more what rate of what you'd be measuring, but other.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking about a couple of these other ones, like knowledge of the benefits could also be captured in a survey. That the leaves are nutritionally beneficial, I think, would just be more of a finding, right, of your research or of your literature review. And I think a market analysis might be a good way to check like what's going on in the market and whether there's enough left over for cattle, or how the diversion of leaves for human consumption might be changing what's available for the cattle in the area. So yeah, did you have a question or like a comment or something?
Oh, no, I was just thinking that semi-structured interviews before and after about perceptions of sweet potatoes.
Definitely, yeah.
Open-ended, qualitative.
I wonder if you can even do quantitative, like ask people their weight changes, if they're more visual things that might indicate that they're healthier and they're not anemic, or not necessarily going to like as far as like blood testing to test their blood glucose levels or anything like that. Like just ask them like, do you feel more hungry more often, and sort of if they're more full, they'll probably can give you like a value, I guess.
Yeah, there are dietary diversity indexes that you can use as like part of surveys to assess how many food groups you've consumed, and so that could be one way.
Yeah, lots of tools.
Oh, I was going to make a suggestion around the market as well before you said it. That could be a good way to measure by seeing the capacity that went to market before versus after. And, what the market, you can survey the market, the sellers, and say how much is this going for, and because they're the ones that really know like how much stuff costs.
Yeah, I would say maybe even well, if you do like a market analysis, also include like what's lost on the way, and what people are throwing away if they're buying it and bringing it home and they don't know how to store it. You might have a loss there that you wouldn't capture using some of the tools that we've just mentioned. Do you have another one?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to our peers here, that the whole like improving maternal child health, like I've been feeling like really overwhelmed by the whole string of things, you know, and so that's like, it seems, you know, we're in this 2-week intervention, and I would consider it a huge success just to change people's perceptions of sweet potato leaves in that time period, you know, and so, you know, we're looking at these things like you showed the global food thing or whatever it was, like, you know.
Not what you should be like striving for.
Even within this context, I get, you know, I don't just want to survey everyone else and feel like, have you been feeling overwhelmed at all?
Too overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And at least I'm like, oh my God, how am I supposed to do this for 2 weeks? Like, how am I supposed to like fix all these different preconditions?
Well,
or, like, the problem, or like with the problem trigger, that was the name, right? Or like, I'm like, oh my God, how am I supposed to do it in 2 weeks?
But I think
this is
that's kind
a chance
of-
to see how it works.
Yeah.
It feels that way too.
I think that's kind of the point of making things like this, is because you see that there's all these contributing factors, and then you kind of go down to the bottom where you're like, okay, but this is something that I can do. This is something that I can look into, and that's kind of your role, is kind of the link between being able to find this stuff out, even if you don't necessarily know it already, and being able to give it in a presentable way to the organization and the people. So I think I think even though it is very overwhelming, anytime you start looking at anything development related, you kind of go into a rabbit hole of all these different things. But by kind of isolating it, you can say, but these are things that I can do, and that'll affect this branch, and then that later will maybe make impacts further down the line.
That's exactly
Exactly
right.
But I also think when I was talking to my organization, they almost wanted me to develop this for them more than for me alone. I mean, I might do 2 where I like one for the organization's overall goals. They're much there for longer, and they're actively trying to change things there, and I'm only there for 2 weeks. So sort of, I think that might help to just say, this is not just for me, it's also for my organization to understand what they should try to go for long term as well. So
I think it's a good exercise, like if you can do it with your organization and then identify together, these are the areas we feel like we can impact, and even like highlighting them or changing the color, and that might feel more manageable when you can focus in on something, but then just be aware of the larger context of what other problems or issues are going on at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I really hope that this, I mean, I think it's okay. It's okay if you're overwhelmed. And I think the next thing we'll talk about, which is the log frame, might help you a little bit with that, because it really hones in on what you're doing and what you have, and how you can kind of, where you can tap into this theory of change and really affect just one or a branch of it. So okay, cool. Okay, so we were just talking about ways to measure some of these things. And that's kind of what monitoring and evaluation is about. Monitoring is kind of like saying, are we on track to meet our objectives? And so it's this kind of like routine assessment of what's happening in your project. And the theory of change can help you identify some of the indicators that you might want to track in your monitoring. So we talked about household surveys to see if people's behavior changed or their perceptions changed before and after your project. Some of those indicators can be really helpful during the monitoring stage, and helps you adapt the way that you're managing your project. So if you do a survey a short time in and realize that your project is having the opposite effect, or an effect that you didn't intend, then that gives you an opportunity to make a shift in how you're managing. An evaluation is more, as I said, the retrospective view of what you did. You can do it if it's a long project, sort of at the time it with some specific milestones in your project, but a lot of projects just do it at the end to analyze how it went. And it's really useful for writing up like reports that you have to turn into Trellis or to whoever, describing like your impact and how you measured your impact. So a theory of change helps you identify what those indicators are that you might want to measure, and helps you connect them to that like larger picture of change that your organization is working within. So the log frame is also an illustration of a change process, but it's at the level of like your individual project or the intervention that you're working on. So it's another graphical illustration usually of 4 components. Activities, which are what you're doing with the resources that you have, and in order to produce outputs, and those outputs can be tangible, like a solar dryer for fruit, or an irrigation system, or they can be social dynamics that are changed, like maybe a community comes together for meetings more often than they did before, or there's more participation of women in community events. So those are all kind of outputs. So your activities lead into your outputs, which you list also in the log frame, and those are the things that you can say, this is what I produced or did in the project. And so you can, include goods and services, products, or other social changes in the outputs section. Outputs, when you think about them together, and especially if you think about them scaled up, it helps you to identify what the outcomes of this type of work are in the community at the level of the beneficiary of your project. So they're so as like social change at that larger scale, or different like economic outcomes can often be listed in the outcomes of the log frame. And then those outcomes, when they're scaled up again or envisioned at a larger scale, can contribute to goals like improved maternal and child health and nutrition. So let me show you. This is the basic structure of a log frame. And you can see the activities, outputs, outcomes, and goals are listed in order, kind of read from the bottom. So if the activities are completed, then the outputs can be produced. If the outcomes are produced, then the outcomes can occur. And if the outcomes occur, then there should be a contribution toward the overall goal. So you would list your activities, outputs, outcomes, and goal in that project description column. And then there's also a space for assumptions on the log frame. And similar to the theory of change, assumptions are like mitigating factors that, if true, keep that relationship between activities and outputs valid, and the relationship between outputs and outcomes valid, and so on. So it's another way of kind of saying like the world is a lot more complicated than what you're like some of the like activities and interventions that you're doing might make it seem, but you know what your assumptions are, and if they hold true, then your project should be successful.
So you don't put inputs in the log frame?
I think the inputs are kind of incorporated into activities in this one. Mm-hmm. You could actually probably put another row if you wanted a way to organize them below activities, I think. I'm not sure that you would need like an assumption connection, but just as a place to put them, to capture them, yeah. So in order for this activity to be achieved, in order for this activity to contribute to this output, this assumption has to hold. It's kind of the logic that you follow. So I was going to do a quick example of moving from a theory of change to a log frame. And since this is kind of related to my project, I was going to focus on this water storage and irrigation branch from this theory of change. So the idea, I think, is that you plot out all the things that are relevant to achieving the long-term outcome. Farmers have a stable year-round income, including what you work on. So in my case, it's water storage and irrigation, but also fertilizer access and market demand. And those are things that I happen to know from being in Uganda and communicating with my organization, that those are, for farmers in this area, those are important but they're not what I work on. So what I work on is water storage, and that's what we're gonna take into the log frame. So the components of that part of the theory of change can kind of be like mapped into the log frame with a few modifications, and you might need to make more or less modifications in order to map things over easily. So I have, in my case, my high level goal in my theory of change, I placed in my outcomes because I actually know that higher than that, there is this like longer term, large scale goal of economic and food security in the eastern region of Uganda. So I decided to put my TOC goal in the outcomes, but it might vary for you. If you want to put it up in the goal section, that's okay too. And then an output of what I did and what I'm doing is that water is available year-round, and that comes from the TOC preconditions. And then an activity that I did, which I modified from the TOC, was that I designed and built locally appropriate irrigation systems. And that, if I go back to the TOC, just comes from their existing water storage and irrigation. So in order to make that happen, this activity was carried out. And I made a couple of assumptions. Farmers know how to use those irrigation systems, also comes from the TOC, and that if they have water available and they know and follow the water requirements of their crops, then they have a stable year-round income. I added a couple other things in here to connect my outcome to my goal. So if farmers have a stable year-round income and they manage their cash flow in a way that optimizes their household level economic and food security, then that contributes to the regional economic and food security goal. So I'm assuming in this log frame that that like local income stability can lead to a larger scale effect only if this household level cash flow is well managed. I think Amanda next week is going to go over, in 2 weeks, is going to go over indicators and means of verification in a lot more detail. So I'm not going to go too far into that right now. But I made a couple here just to sort of illustrate. So in order to track the output, I could track flow rates of water delivered into irrigation systems, and that would tell me, is water available year-round, or is there a big drop during the dry season? And I would track that with flow rate equipment and keep that data over time to recognize trends. Indicators for outcomes can be really tricky, and I have some resources I can share with you to like help you identify what your indicators should look like at each of these levels. But one that I thought about for stable income is that tracking income monthly might give me a sense of like how that income changes during the year. If it changes a lot during the dry season, then I might know that there's something that's not really working in my project or in my assumptions. So I would track that through farmer surveys. Does anybody have any questions about log frame or about this example?
I have a question. Just to clarify, they read with arrows to the left and right, like kind of bouncing back and forth?
Yeah, so it's read vertically from activities to goals, but also horizontally from left to right, and then up a step back right. So I can go back to that.
Yeah, that one.
This one. Okay, yeah. Cool. So yeah, I'm not sure why assumptions aren't just put in the second column. This is the way that everyone does it, and I think it's kind of weird and confusing, but maybe you guys can be the first to like set the trend. But yeah, and so there is this horizontal logic as well as the vertical logic.
So really each row reads backwards and forwards. Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions about log frame?
I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah, so is there no space for monitoring and evaluation in the log frame?
In the log frame? So you're asking if there's space for monitoring and evaluation.
Yeah, so we don't deal with how to monitor, after we do the project, how to monitor them or evaluate them.
Mm-hmm.
Things like
Yeah, so let me go back to my MNE slide. So the monitoring and evaluation kind of encompasses both theory of change and log frame and your own like narrative of what happened in your project or what is happening in your project. So a monitoring and evaluation plan could contain both a theory of change showing the big change process that you're kind of getting involved in, and then also your log frame showing what you're doing and how you think that's contributing to an outcome. And then the rest of your monitoring and evaluation plan would contain probably some narrative describing what you did, why you did it, supported by your log frame and your TOC, and then what your outcomes were. So yeah, I think the components of M&E that are included in the log frame structure are really kind of rooted around the indicators and the verification. So those are the things that in your M&E plan you'll want to refer back to say, here's what I tracked, here's why I tracked it, and my data shows that this was my impact. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Cool. Are there any other questions?
I think I just wanted to add, I've seen another kind of version that unpacks like a table of outputs, and then at the top it has indicator, target value, the tool or method, and the frequency of data collection. And so you would list for each outcome you have, like this output is like, we're gonna, you know, build a bioethanol plant or whatever. And then the indicator is like existence of 2 plants or you know, centers. And then the target value is, you know, how many liters of output, maybe not that, is like how many plants there are, like 5, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
And then like the tool or method would be like, how are we going to collect that? Like, is it gonna be a survey? Is it gonna be a walk around and see it? And then the frequency of data collection is like, how often are we gonna measure that? Is that a further step within this that you can do, or is that just a different way of thinking?
Yeah, no, I think that is kind of like what you do once you've filled out your first log frame and checked it with the organization, and you know that that you and the organization are on the same page. Then you can start talking about what your targets are for those indicators and whether they're the right indicators, if you need other ones. Who's measuring them is another item that I've seen in M&E matrices. So making sure that there's some accountability in the like personnel who are involved in M&E can be important, especially for projects that are in politically sensitive contexts. So yes, and I can even show you, so the one that RIFA required us to do had a lot of other columns as well. So I could show you that one if you want to see it, and what I think it's filled out. I'm not sure if it's very good for my project, but if you want to see another.
One, Mariah.
Yeah.
I don't know, is now good. I don't want to
yeah, let me see if
I can show people the one we're actually going to require Trellis students to fill out with their organization.
yeah, now is good. I was going to do one more example. I thought with your project, if we could start to like fill in log frame, but I think we have time. So let's.
Okay.
See.
Do you want me to?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you want to send it to me, or
Yeah,
how
I can
does?
share my screen really quickly.
Oh, okay.
You can share your screen.
So should I stop sharing?
We can go
Oh.
automatically. Yeah. Okay.
Wow.
I'm gonna unmute myself for a second. Are you able to mute yourself? Sorry. Okay. Okay. We will figure this out. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen right now, and I will pull this up on the PyStar homepage. Everyone should have access to this. It's under reporting here, and it's just called the Monitoring and Evaluation Plan Matrix. This is the template that we've decided to use. So all of the Trellis Fund organizations have a copy of this.
or they should get one in the next couple of weeks because it's getting sent out with their sub-award contract. So part of their contract is to submit one of these monitoring and evaluation plans in order to get the second half of their funding. And so we're asking the fellows to work with your organization to complete one of these. And so there are 3 pages in this template. I guess we should start on the 3rd page. Sorry, they're ordered. The order's kind of off. But this is an example of the logic model, just one example of what Mariah has been talking to us about. And so you can feel free to use this as a template. And then if you scroll up to the 1st page, this is a blank monitoring and evaluation framework template. So kind of moving from the log frame into figuring out what are we measuring, what are the indicators, who's responsible for collecting the data, how often will it be collected, and then on page 2, it's just an example of one that's been completed. So these are available for you to use on the PyStar homepage. I think we had a question come in the chat. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. No, I think we're okay. So I will go ahead and mute myself again, and then you're welcome to reshare your screen.
We can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear us, guys? We can't hear you.
You want to say anything?
Sorry about that. Oh no. Okay, so I had just said after Lauren stopped speaking that what she showed is like a kind of like a log frame plus indicators and means of measuring indicators and target values for those indicators. So it's a log frame that kind of maps all that data collection and all the M&E nuts and bolts into your log frame. So that's a really good way to do it. And I think this, what I'm showing you now is kind of like the simplest possible way. So for sure you can, if you want to or need to tackle a more complicated grid to organize all of this, you should. So did I say anything else after that? I forget.
Just
Trying to catch
start
up.
working on
Yeah. So we are just quickly kind of trying to plot out a log frame and draft some of the components of it for Claire's project. So she was just telling us about how one of the kind of goals of her project is to, or one of the outputs of her project is to help farmers understand better how to produce juice and create some infrastructure for helping them do that. So it's kind of a value addition project with a high level goal of increasing farmer incomes. So if they know how to produce juice and they have the processing center, what's the outcome of that?
Juice.
Like their juice is an outcome. So farmers are producing and selling juice. And if they're producing and selling juice, they're getting a higher income. Is that more or less the chain? Okay.
Basically, yeah.
And what are your building a processor?
Yeah, I'll be helping select the equipment that they'll be purchasing and organizing their processing center. And then also training.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Great. So is there anything you can think of that might prevent you or mitigate that activity from achieving its outputs?
Like assumptions?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One big one that I'm thinking of is ability to transport juice to markets and to have, I guess it'd be higher up.
Yep. It would be here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess above that, there would be people buying the juice and the stores selling the juice. Having a market for it, I guess.
What about long-term storage? I don't know how.
Yeah, that's another thing.
It'll sit.
Yeah, or cold storage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then what about in this one? Even if you do these activities, is there anything that might prevent those activities from leading to outputs?
Yeah, I guess overall, one of the other goals is to have a way to utilize extra crop.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of introduce other products so that the market isn't saturated just with mangoes and oranges.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the assumption is that there will be extra crop
Mm-hmm.
to produce other products from.
Oh, I see. Okay, so they're already producing oranges and mangoes.
They have oranges and mangoes,
Yeah.
but they want to do some value addition.
Okay, with the extra that they, is that what you?
I think so.
Okay.
I think it's extra.
Okay.
But also maybe developing like a side market.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
A damaged tree or something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What about like maintenance of equipment? 'Cause
Yeah.
that might be hard. It's like the only one they can't find replacement parts.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Would that go in this one or in here?
Yeah, I guess it'd go there.
I think it would go on the first one because in order for the farmers to be able to produce juice, the equipment needs to function.
That's true.
So yeah, maybe that would go in the second one. Farmers are producing the third one. Either way.
Did they have any issues growing the fruit? Like for example, like pests or diseases?
I think fruit flies are a really big issue. So, yeah.
Like
There's so many assumptions.
Yeah, yeah, I know this kind of can be scary, but but also these are things that we are sitting here in Davis, California, thinking like, oh,
Right.
maybe this like can affect it. But I'm sure when you get there, you might realize some of these are not valid or not relevant to what you're doing.
It's kind
so.
of worst case scenario.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
what else.
Well, other things will be that we aren't even.
Right, yeah.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
can't even think of all of this.
Yeah, things will change, I'm sure. Okay, so can we think of a way that you would track or how a metric for farmers knowing how to produce juice?
We see juice in the market,
Mm-hmm.
so like a market analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess that would be more of means of verification, right?
Yeah, market analysis
So an
would be
indicator
here.
would be that juice is being produced.
Or how many people are getting trained to produce juice.
Yep.
Yeah, because I'm training people that will be training. I'm doing like trainer of
Trainers.
trainers.
Yeah.
So
Training.
yeah, number of people trained is.
Mm-hmm.
With juices being produced go into the box above that one though,
Mm.
because the outcome is farmers are producing juice.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like indicators would be like number of plants, like I don't know, number of centers, or like
Mm.
if they expand, like there's such a high demand, they need another center. That would be a good indicator that it's working.
That it's working, and that
number
would go.
of people in, like
Working.
utilizing the.
And that would be here, or would
I think
that
it would
be
go down one.
Yeah.
So number of people trained and number of people utilizing the center.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that the means of verification for that would be, I guess, like a log of the processing center itself, or like a survey of the organization who's kind of in charge of the processing center.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, good. What's a means of verifying that juice is being produced?
I think that would be market analysis.
Are you planning to do market analysis, or does your organization do that?
That's a good question.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Yeah. So this kind of exercise can
It's
make
really
you go like, huh, like, are we actually doing that? Or
Mhm.
or maybe there's another indicator that we're not thinking of that they have that they're using to track how much is being produced or whether what they're doing is working. So yeah. And then indicators of goals is like, ooh, that's a pretty that's pretty far outside. Like this goal is not meant to be something that you have your hands on changing necessarily. So indicators for that could be things like government data, government like tracking of farmer incomes, which I don't think happens in Uganda, just to let you know, because I looked for it. And yeah, so I think these are less important than the ones that you need to track for your M&E plan, which are kind of show up in this middle section. And for activities, the indicators tend to be really just related to what's happening in your project,
Kind of
like
like reception of how you're doing and or how people are understanding you, kind of thing.
Yeah. I think, well, I guess it's more internal to the project team, usually, and not always, but I think with in order to be able to indicate that you've selected processing equipment, maybe your indicator is like
Ordering.
Yeah, order like receipts or yeah, like tracking of like what you're doing day to day in your own work. And training operators again would be like your own records of number of processing center operators who are trained. So those kind of tend to be a little weird to like think of and track, but also good to keep track of and to think about as you're doing this, because it helps you, even though it's not like an external impact on the community, it's helpful for you to make sure that you're staying on track with your work.
Okay.
So yeah. Any other questions about this?
I have a question for Lauren. The the one that you showed us, is that the exact one that we'll be filling out, or is it just more of a?
No, that's the one.
That's the
I'm
one,
sorry,
okay.
Mariah, I didn't share that.
It's okay. Yeah.
That was an oversight. But yes, the
Okay.
one that's on PyStar is the one you're gonna fill in with your organization. And so we'll meet again in 2 weeks on February 14th, where we'll focus on taking the log. So the way I'm thinking of it right now is you have theory of change, which Mariah talked about. It kind of feeds into the log frame, and the log frame feeds into the monitoring and evaluation plan. And so the M&E plan is actually what the organizations have to submit for their contract, as part of their contract. So I think it would make the most sense if over the next 2 weeks, you could try to work on, the theory of change is not something you have to submit to us, but it's probably good, just start working through the mental process. But if you could do the log frame for next week, or in 2 weeks from now, have the log frame ready, and then take a stab at the M&E plan. Amanda's really gonna dive into figuring out indicators and how to measure them. So I'll type this up in an email for the homework, but I think getting your log frame done and starting to familiarize yourself with the monitoring evaluation plan makes sense.
Yeah. Did she give you a worksheet that you can work through for identifying like the components of? She shared one with me that I gave to you guys for 203. And it's pretty good. If you want it, I can send it
that'd be great.
to you again. Yeah. It's a good way to just like even like print it out and like scribble down your thoughts and kind of get it all organized.
Yeah, that'd be great. I can share that when I share your presentation room today.
Cool. Yeah, and Amanda did mention to me that she wanted me to say for you guys to bring in your log frame when she comes.
Great. So everyone do the log frame.
But I think it's like you don't just do it, like you're supposed to like do it once and then come back to it. Yeah, so don't worry if you have holes or you don't know something. Or,
take a stab at it.
Yeah. 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 Any other questions? Oh, I had some resources for theory of change on this slide. So when you share the slides, you can get to these. Especially, actually there's one more, that PMD guide that we're using in 203 has a section on developing indicators. I haven't showed it to Amanda, so I don't know what she'll think of it, but I might share that with you or send it your way and point out which page it is.
Yeah.
If you guys get into indicators and are trying to think about how to start with that, it's a really good guide for that. Yeah, okay, that's all I have for today. Yeah.
Thank you. Could we swap mute and unmute?
Yep.
Again?
Sorry. How do I do that again?
Maybe stop share.
Okay, there.
Yeah, and then
Okay. Hi, everyone. I just have a couple of quick announcements. First of all, thank you so much, Mariah, for coming in. I know we had a last-minute change in our instructor schedule, so Mariah really pinch hitted here very well. So thank you so much for coming in. We really appreciate it. I think it was a really informative presentation and a good place to get us started on thinking about M&E. So I'll capture all of the stuff in a follow-up email, but just a reminder, if you could let us know when you're planning on traveling, as soon as you know, that would be great. I know some people might not have a date picked yet, which is fine, but even just ballpark, especially if you're traveling sooner rather than later, we just want to make sure you're prepared and that all your ducks are in a row before you go. So homework for next week. This is pretty brief, but we're going to be talking about gender and nutrition next week. So if everyone could just come prepared with a little bit of background information on gender and nutrition in your country, that would be great. You could do a Google search, look on the FAO website. Just try to come prepared with a little bit of background knowledge because we'll have 2 presenters next week. As I said, if you could fill in your log frame for 2 weeks from now, so the February 14th session, and then also the M&E template, at least get a look at that. I have started to, and I'm going to share my screen again just for a second here.
When the log frame
next week or the week after?
The week after. So next week is the gender and nutrition background info, and then 2 weeks from now is your log frame. And something I just wanted to share, as I've been updating documents. So also on the PyStar homepage, there is this advice from previous Trellis Fellows document. I hope you've gotten a chance to look at that. I think it's pretty useful. I'm still receiving some final reports from this past round of fellows in 2017. And so as I've been updating documents on PyStar, I've been trying to make my updates red so you can distinguish between what is recently added information. So I have feedback from a student just this last round for your reference. Okay, so I think that is it. Thank you everyone so much for attending and being timely, and thanks to Mariah for presenting, and don't hesitate to email us if you have any questions or thoughts. Okay. Thanks. I was